In this one, Fairley lays out what he says are connections between Islam and Catholicism. As you may have already guessed, the connections are made the same way you can make a connection between Melbourne, Australia and Halifax, Nova Scotia, with a whole lot of silly putty stretched really thin. The first connection he makes is between women's wear. But we're not told, as usual, how this correspondence came to be or why it should be considered significant. So they both wear head coverings and long gowns. So what? Both of these go back to standard outerwear for women even in the time of the Jewish Old Testament, and so on into the time of Jesus. Also in the New Testament era, Greek and Roman women sometimes covered their heads with an item called a hematon. So what we have here is just a universal custom of fashion, and in religious context the expression of modesty as a virtue, not some sort of mystical religious connection. In fact, it's more complex than that. The habits worn by Catholic nuns can be traced through an evolution of clothing that began early in church history, with monastic garb worn by certain believers in the 4th century. There's a popular history of the subject found here, in The Habit by Elizabeth Coons. Now if this is true, then the evolution of the habit worn by Catholic nuns started even before Islam existed. So what sort of connection does Fairley think exists here? Maybe he ought to try to explain, instead of copying these ideas off of conspiracy websites without criticizing them. The next connection Fairley draws is that in both religions people are taught to pray with beads. Well, true. But prayer beads are also used in Hinduism, Buddhism, and by the Eastern Orthodox. In addition, instead of beads, some use ropes with knots in them. Why? Well, for some people, they're a good way to aid in concentration during prayer. According to this Anthropology Museum website, Muslims use beads as a memory aid when counting the 99 attributes of Allah. Catholics formerly used beads as an aid to illiterate worshippers to help them keep track of their prayers. In the end, the connection is a practical one, and is no more significant than the fact that both Islam and Christianity use paper and binding to preserve their respective scriptures. Let's now do some fast checks of some other comparisons. Aside from the absurd connection to the Babylonian Nebo, which we discussed earlier, this is meaningless. Marian apparitions have also historically been said to have appeared in places like hills, mountains, chapels, and gardens. If these are real, is God supposed to say, "Oh darn, Mary can't appear in a cave because Nebo did? Scratch that off the list"? And presumably Fairley will be able to find some sort of pagan deity who manifested himself in similar places and force some other connection. And of course the connection of all of this to Santa Claus grottos is little more than abject paranoia. That last statement gives away the store. Fairley essentially admits that without his assumption that both serve the same system, which we have repeatedly debunked here, the consecration to a new purpose means there's no argument for a connection. Triumphant reclamation as an answer corresponds better to the evidence. Well, doesn't that simply mean that certain music and tones are best for inducing a religious state of mind? Protestant churches also use solemn music, as do many religious traditions. This is human sensory psychology at work, not some mystical connection bound to mystery religion. What does Fairley expect the Catholics to do? Start using rock music? This might be expected in religious traditions which share the idea that God is all-seeing and all-knowing. And of course notice the symbol in Milan is a triangle, which as we noted earlier makes it a Trinitarian and Christian variation with its own meaning. I'll leave aside commentary on Catholic theology, which is beyond my scope of knowledge, but I'll close with one comment and one correction. The comment is on the drive-by indication that the philosophy of Aristotle is thoroughly satanic. No explanation for this is given, and it would be nice if Fairley would explain it, and do more than just sound like Fred Phelps in the pulpit. As for the correction, in claiming anti-Semitism as a common trait of Islam and Catholicism, Fairley says the Jews were granted full citizenship of Rome in 212 AD. Actually, in 212, citizenship was granted to all free citizens of the Roman Empire, not just Jews. This vid gets a rating of 1/4 tank. Fairley loses points in this one immediately just for the title, The Dark Ages. As we noted in this vid, this is a prejudicial term that real historians have stopped using, and the claim that the time was dark is rooted in modern mythologies about that period, not historical fact. On the other hand, after a few vague and general diversions, Fairley does get one major point right. the so-called donation of Constantine being a forgery. He also gets essentially right that Pepin, leader of the Franks, was chosen, and he was bribed with the promise that if he cooperated in this mission, his place in heaven would be secured. That's sort of right, but not exactly clear. Pepin was promised rewards in heaven, and was reminded that he risked damnation if he didn't fulfill his promises. He was also reminded that St. Peter had promised him eternal life. Whether this was a bribe, as Fairley says, or more like a reminder, isn't clear from the words. But it kind of suggests that it was more like a reminder that a second letter had to be written to Pepin begging him to get moving. Here's a really strange claim. Tertullian lived from about 160 to 220 AD. I don't think he could have managed that one. Even more strangely, serious histories assign this quote to Johann Tetzel, who lived from 1465 to 1519. Since Fairley in the next section discusses the Reformation era, I can only assume he mixed up his source material. Not very professional. I won't address some of the rather vague claims such as that those who did not willingly submit to the authority of the church were persecuted and killed for heresy. I need more specifics than that to engage, but it does lead me to wonder if Fairley falls for the sort of myths we address in this vid. He does get generally right what Pope Leo X had to do with indulgences, but after that truly embarrasses himself by using this bogus quote we discussed in a prior vid. Over the years I've used that one as a signal that someone is truly a poor researcher. We'll close with this claim, which is really off the wall. This claim appears unsourced on a lot of amateur websites, but if it's true, I'd like to see Fairley name all 500 of those languages. Thanks to a discussion forum frequented by those interested in Bible translation, I can give him a list of 13 to start. Maybe Fairley can fill in the gaps for us. He only has 487 languages to go. This vid gets a rating of half a tank. Fairley's piece on the Reformation is not all that bad to start, provided you adjust for repeats of the same errors from prior vids. After that, a good number of facts don't bear out. It's true, for example, that Johannes Huss was burned at the stake, but that he was burned with copies of Wycliffe's Bibles isn't true at all. And it certainly isn't mentioned in a report written by a near contemporary, which refers only to wood and straw as fuel for the fire. There's also no mention of Huss making a prophecy about someone showing up 100 years later. That appears to be a bogus quote that would happen when someone conflated something said by Huss with something said by Jerome of Prague. Another problem relates to what's said of Thomas Linacre. The quote is real, but the context is wrong, and the hint is given in the fact that the part about original Greek is in parentheses. In reality, Linacre said this after picking up the New Testament for the first time and reading the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically read the part that prohibited swearing. It's then said that Linacre threw the Bible away with an oath. But as his biographer Johnson adds, there's some uncertainty about whether the story is true in the first place, and Johnson says it's refuted by Linacre's normal tendency towards moderation. Either way, it had nothing to do with the Latin Bible being corrupt. And I should say that this is the sort of mistake researchers like Fairley make when they fail to consult things like Johnson's biography, and rely instead on non-scholarly conspiracy websites like this one. Fairley relies on the same site for information on John Colet, and that's not much better. He copies from there the claim that after Colet translated the Bible into English, the people were so happy about hearing the Word of God in a language they could understand, that 20,000 of them packed the church. This one also appears to be apocryphal. This biography of Colet by John Gleason does note that Colet preached to large crowds numbering in the thousands, but attributes his popularity to his preaching style, not because he translated the Bible into English. The same conspiracy site informs Fairley when he says that Erasmus translated the New Testament into Latin because he decided to correct the corrupt Latin Vulgate. Well, sort of. It's true that his goal was to make the gospel message more clear, but there's no sign he thought the Vulgate had been corrupted because of evil intentions, as opposed to being less accurate than it could have been because of factors like inadequate knowledge. Robert Coogan, in this book, Erasmus Lee and the Correction of the Vulgate, said the goal of Erasmus was to apply what were, in his time, modern methods of scholarship to the translation of the text, using methods that the original compilers of the Vulgate didn't have access to. And yes, he did believe that the Vulgate had been subject to certain corruptions, as well as interpolations. But there's nothing, again, to indicate that he considered this to have happened as part of some evil intention to hide the truth. What is meant by corruptions here is the same sort of thing textual critics think that the Greek copies of the New Testament were subject to over the course of the transmission of the New Testament. The material on Tyndale and Luther is short and makes some accurate points, but it's questionable on some details, like the Tyndale Bible ending up in Henry VIII's bedroom. You can find far better sources for things like Tyndale's life in books like this one, Ronald Worth's Church, Monarch, and Bible in 16th Century England. Worth points out, for example, that the alleged meeting between Luther and Tyndale that Fairley refers to is a possibility, but not a certainty. But he does confirm Fairley's claim that when Tyndale's enemies bought his Bibles in bulk in order to burn them, Tyndale used the profits to print more copies. Worth also confirms what Fairley says about Tyndale's last words. Then Fairley says this. This is partly true. Worth notes that it was claimed that the Tyndale Bible has 2,000 errors. That counts as thousands. It's not quite true that they could find no errors at all, though. Worth points out that even Tyndale himself conceded that he had made errors. I'm going to leave this part at that since the presentation after is relatively simple, and to that extent doesn't get a lot wrong. And I'm willing to give this vid a 3/4 tank rating. There's very little history in this part, which is also relatively simple. Mostly it's sort of a sermon, so I'll deliver one of my own. I would say here that it's rather simplistic as well as dangerous to do as Fairley does and pose all these matters in dualistic terms, as though the Catholic Church were some sort of evil institution hell-bent on deceiving people. That's partly based on Fairley's absurd claims from earlier in his presentation, as well as an apparent desire to find what he's looking for. But let's not forget that the Reformers were hardly angels themselves at all times. Martin Luther, for example, was an anti-Semite. And let's not make Fairley's mistake of turning everything into a dualistic nightmare. Either way, I'll rate this one neutral.